All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming today. I wanted to start out with just a little bit of a framework for how we look at fraud. It's a six-part process. We prevent fraud, detect fraud, investigate fraud, resolve fraud, which could be prosecution or could be firing someone, recovering from fraud, and retooling processes that may have been exposed to be vulnerable during the investigative process. It takes decades of experience to know what tool to use and at the right time in each of these processes. There are many, many, many tools. Anything from the old-fashioned dumpster diving to physical surveillance, video surveillance, document examination. But today's presentation is on artificial intelligence and data analytics. So the goal is obvious. We want to protect taxpayer money and we want to ensure that grant money is spent as intended. So we're using AI and data analytics to identify patterns of possible fraud, identify unusual trends, identify unusual transaction, and something that's in the abuse, waste of, we talk about waste, fraud, and abuse. Waste and abuse category is to identify any unnecessary spending. There are many other benefits that come along across the way, but those are our major goals. So if you attended our last webinar, which is available on our YouTube channel and on our website, you might recognize this screen. Artificial intelligence looks at unstructured data such as text or PDFs and documents, but it also looks at Excel spreadsheets data such as structured data. Structured data is the data that fits into cells. It has a birth date or a social security number or even text, but it's structured. It fits into one cell. And so artificial intelligence is much better at looking at text than it is at structured data, although it does both. Artificial intelligence brilliantly identifies risks and provides background information. It identifies unusual patterns without even having to identify what unusual is. You may not think of a risk, and it will come up with a risk that you just didn't even imagine. AI is prone to error and incompleteness, and therefore the information must be validated, and it provides inconsistent results. Sometimes you can put in the same query 3 times, get 3 different answers, often because it thinks you're not happy with the first answer, and so it will change the answer along the way. Data analytics extracts insights from historical data, cleans and validates the data. It entails a huge process in what we call cleaning or normalizing the data, which we'll talk about a little bit more as the presentation goes on. Data analytics is for analyzing structured data. This data can be easily visualized, and it provides very precise outcomes. But that being said, neither tool should be used to provide definitive proof of fraud. There's kind of this tendency today to think that technology can do everything. Well, we're big believers that you need human vetted analytics and investigation for various reasons. So let's take a look at artificial intelligence, and I'm going to turn over to Pete to talk about key terms.
Thank you very much, Mary Beth. Artificial intelligence, AI, is the broad umbrella term for computer systems that can mimic human behavior. So performing tasks that typically require human intelligence or research that requires lots of hours, AI really helps to minimize those tasks by doing it through a computer process. Under that umbrella of artificial intelligence is the first subset, machine learning. It basically was our first shift away from if-then statements to using more pattern analysis to make predictions based on the data that you have uploaded. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning where we are linking multiple data sources and transformers of this data, trying to mimic the human brain in order to process complex patterns, complex data sets, and links that are just of a larger in nature. Generative AI. I know I use this, might be the one that you're most familiar with, because I know I use this with my kids to take images of their teddy bears and make them come alive. But we've seen a lot of growth in this area recently with generating text, images, audio, but then also importantly, code. A lot of the hard coding that was done in the past is no longer necessary. So having an understanding of how you're able to import code that you get from an AI can really speed up your process and help you achieve things that maybe if you're not a coding person, you'd be able to do. So how is this all powered? Large language models, including ChatGPT, Grok, Cloud, and Gemini, Google Gemini, are all large language models. These three words are important: large, massive data sets, just expansive beyond anything that could be hosted on a single computer. Language, it's very, very strong within text. And then model. This model predicts, based on your inputs, what the output should be. And the best analogy I have for that is, if anyone's seen the movie Good Will Hunting, Matt Damon's character has a photographic memory, he's a voracious reader, and can draw on a large reference to finished sentences. And there's a famous scene in the bar where he hears a couple of words, then is able to attribute that to the correct passage in a book, page number and paragraph. I look at large language models the same way. They aggregate massive amounts of data, store it within their brain, so to speak, and then can pull from it and then predict what the answer will be based on that vast database of knowledge. A couple of more in-depth terms within AI: prompt engineering. Prompts, and you'll see this later in the demo, are how you ask the questions of AI or generate any results. You want to craft your prompts in a way that gives you the detail necessary. Sometimes if you leave them open-ended, you can get hallucinations. Hallucinations are when AI makes up or provides false information. We've actually seen this happen within legal cases recently, where an AI tool provided a case that was completely fabricated. And so there's a major concern there, and you need to always vet the data that you're getting out of any AI tool. And again, as Mary Beth said, that human aspect of the AI process. And then finally, there's an inherent bias based on the data that these large language models use. Gender, race, cultural, especially political these days, where an AI's output might be biased. And so it's always important to go through, determine whether the outcomes are what you were looking for / make sense. That's why we use AI as a tipster rather than a final delivery product. And so some of these security concerns that we've seen recently are, a good example is people using their personal phones or personal ChatGPT accounts, any AI tool, and uploading sensitive information, bypassing their protocols to use it and uploading this data. That could potentially be released to the public and could potentially train these models. Now, there's a lot of security concerns to be mitigated by choosing which one, turning off certain, opting out of certain training models. But this data is extremely valuable to these companies, and they will look for it wherever they can get it. A couple examples of this that really had a lot of financial operational impact. Within Samsung, employees inadvertently uploaded some of their source code and in using ChatGPT. And so obviously getting Samsung source code out to the internet, potentially findable by competitors or anyone, could have some significant risk. Amazon actually noted that their corporate lawyers noted that some of the generated code from ChatGPT closely mimic internal Amazon data, probably showing that there was a leak at some point, and they were able to match it up. And so it's definitely a concern in, when using AI to be sensitive about what data you're uploading. And that moves into the best practices. So conforming to the agency's policy, any or organization, department, wherever, most groups have started an AI policy, or at least are at the beginning of that. Something we've mentioned, don't use it for outcomes. I like to use AI in steps along the way. Identify risk, unusual trends, help me research, look for more background information on this. It's like you have the best researcher and heads down analyst in the world by your side. Opt out of model training. And then finally, one of the ways you're able to really minimize the risk on this is to anonymize the data. Or if the data is just not, if it's too sensitive, avoid using AI, use more traditional methods. And finally, just a way to anonymize the data. One thing that we do well is just converting names and numbers, any PII that's out there, into a crosswalk where you keep the crosswalk sensitive and you anonymize the information that you're uploading. With that, I'll turn it over back, I believe, Mary Beth.
Okay, so before we do our demonstration, I'd just like to set the stage a bit. The goal of this demonstration is to identify risks or unusual trends in programs for refugees and unaccompanied alien children. Now, we could have chosen any type of grant program for utilities or construction, major infrastructure, unemployment benefits, housing, etc. But what we did is we just made a decision to focus on this particular program, something I have a deep passion about. So we intentionally limited this demo to publicly available information for obvious reasons. Pete uploaded over 10,000 pages of single audits, and we recognize that single audits have already identified the fraud, but because of the purposes of this demonstration, we use that as our example. And single audits and subrecipient monitoring are the first line of defense for those overseeing large grant programs. And we go into that in quite a bit of detail in our last webinar. And so when our methodologies are applied to individual grant programs, results will be far, far more powerful. For example, if we were privileged to serve you as your outside data team, investigative data team, we could get into much more powerful information. But nevertheless, I think this shows you what AI can do. Pete, I'll turn it back over to you.
So I look at using AI in any of these processes as pulling the thread, cutting an onion, pulling the layers back. And so in this one, we started at the 30,000 foot level of aggregating all single state audits from 2023 and 2024. I should caveat that all available that have been submitted with no issues. We wanted to determine pervasive findings and material weaknesses across these, so you get an idea of what's going on across states in these single audits. We narrowed it down to unaccompanied children, child, and migrant and refugee, and any weaknesses around that area, and then wanted to dig now down to the base layer at discover and looking for specific programs, agencies with major findings that could potentially have a high potential for fraud. And so with that, I will move over to a demo. And this is NotebookLM. It is powered by Google Gemini. And as Mary Beth said, I uploaded more than 80 single state audits. Some of them had not been submitted. And again, this is really the power of some of these tools. Imagine, I'm sure everyone on this call has gone through PDFs just for days. And it's very hard, even within some PDFs, to match data from paragraph 7 to paragraph 300, or have an audit report from Arizona match potentially has the same issue with something from Connecticut. That kind of research and just the ability to connect that information is, at least it's beyond my brain. And so this really helps to consolidate a lot of that data, then pull from it. And so within the single audits, I wanted to look for common findings and material weaknesses across these reports. And you'll see there's a little bit of a buffer time, but again, it's going through more than 80 sources, more than 10,000 pages, and identifying any indicators of findings or material weaknesses. I like now too, because while it's thinking, it gives you an idea of what it's thinking about. Okay, so here we go. Weaknesses or findings across these reports. I'm going to highlight the ones that we found. Number 1, weaknesses in subrecipient monitoring and oversight. 2, deficiencies in financial reporting and closing processes. 3, reporting compliance failures. 4 system and IT control weaknesses. I'm really interested in, as Mary Beth said, in weakness number 1. So weakness in subrecipient monitoring and oversight. And now I'm going to tailor the prompt a bit more to ask specifically, are there any findings or weaknesses with subrecipients focused on unaccompanied migrant or refugee children? Again, there is definitely a little bit of a lag when you're putting it in, but that's the machine, it's the large language model thinking. I also want to note that this tool that we use here, NotebookLM, it's a sandbox, really. We upload our information into it, and only this information is included unless you ask it to go out to the internet. So you have customizable features on that. Okay, it looks like there's a lot. So are there any finding weaknesses in refugee and entrant assistant programs? That's really what we were looking for. And we focused in on Washington State. We noticed that there was back-to-back years, 33 out of 41 subrecipients failed to weren't monitored, and none of the 56 subrecipients in the subsequent period were monitored. So we really focused it on this one. And again, now we're at the 15,000 foot level. We've got a bunch of other states here, but this helps us to start diving into these threads, pulling the thread and seeing where this goes. And so what I did from there was wanted to go into Washington State. I mentioned deep learning earlier. One of the things that could help is, so now I have all this information from single audits on Washington State with failures and weaknesses in sub-recipient monitoring for unaccompanied children. I entered a prompt to go out to the internet, look for all of the official reports, federal, state, local, that or from the programs themselves that identified anything to do with this topic. As you can see, it provided a lot of source material. I'm not sure how many pages are in here, but I know that this one takes longer, so it's a fairly massive amount of data. And I'm gonna queue up again another prompt on subrecipient monitoring related to these unaccompanied children. I do have to say, so sometimes, depending on what your output is, if it's just text, it's fairly, or that will be the quickest. Some of the tools or some of the outputs you can get are things like podcasts and videos, which actually have been fairly impressive. And it brings me back to the Napster days of letting your computer run for a while, because those do take quite a long time to run. Okay, so we have some good outputs here. Number 1, within subrecipient monitoring related to unaccompanied children in Washington State, failures in monitoring refugee and immigrant assistance programs. So this one jumps out at you because in fiscal year 2023, the department did not monitor 33 of 41. Next year, any of its 56 program subrecipients. So I wanted to see, okay, well, they were reported and the monitoring was ineffective. So can I find any program level data? Now trying to get to the on the ground level data. One thing I would mention too is I like to bounce ideas off of this tool and any AI tool that are out there. Again, I said it's the best research and hard data analyst assistant that you'll be able to find. And so in here, there were a number of subrecipients noted. The one that we focused in on is United Way of King County. This was actually part of a larger AmeriCorps issue within the Office of Financial Management. And so now we're at the program level. Now we can figure out, okay, within these programs, how did this actually occur? And so this is a demo of how you can get from a question. We started with, I want to know pervasive weaknesses across single state audit reports. I found a weakness I keyed in on. Then I wanted to add a qualifier on it that it was around children, unaccompanied children, migrants, and refugees. Then I wanted to find a state where it's actually really a problem, or where it's a major finding. We got there. Then I wanted to get to program level data. And so now we're out of there's one named United Way of King County. We have 1 of 56. That's how we pull the thread to get down to the base layer of data. And if we have the opportunity to engage with you, that's when you're allowed to That's when you can integrate program data, financial data, operational data to some of these larger publicly available data sources in order to determine path forward to mitigate any risk that your organization might have of fraud. With that, Mary Beth, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay. Well, that's a perfect segue into our next slide, which is just a few more examples of ways that of outcomes from AI. So we looked at $1 billion worth of developments that were funded by grants in one program, and we came up with a risk that we had not expected, and that is that developers were not building the projects, which was predictable, but that they were actually making as much as $1 million of interest on that grant money. Others were investing those funds and they lost money. We found that contracts routinely exceeded budgets by 50% or more. And we also found that the awarding agency forwarded a grant reimbursement for the precise dollar amount as the grantee's losses on its P&L statement. And what that means is that what it looks like it means, and of course we'd have to dig a lot further, is that the developers are supposed to be financially viable. The developer was not. They were showing a loss. And for whatever reason, the city decided to balance their P&L and forward them the exact dollar amount. Okay, and that doesn't seem proper because obviously grant funds should go for construction, not to make a developer's financials look good. Another case, 100% of payroll expenditures were spent on overhead, only overhead, and none went into operating the program. Single audits reported the exact same data 2 years in a row. The dollars did not add up. And obviously, if you have a fraudulent audit, which this turned out to be, then you have a fraudulent program, which this turned out to be. And this program, which I talked about in our last webinar, was Feeding Our Future, which is all over the news again since we did that webinar. And then another finding was kind of interesting. It was a small town. Shredding costs, special shredding costs, went up significantly in the midst of the investigation. So these are just things we want to know. So we have a quick question for you. Are you or your department using AI to analyze large data sets? If you could just post your answer in the chat, it would be very helpful to us to understand, where you are in the use of AI. Okay, let's see. Okay. Okay, we see some no's, not yets. Yes, from Marilyn. Okay. All right, this is really, really helpful. It's always hard when you do a presentation to know, are you being too elementary or are you being too advanced? And so this is just, again, very helpful. Keep posting those chats. We'd really like to know. So with that, let me go on to data analytics, right? Pete talked about that thread. Well, now we're going to get on the more micro level and look at program-specific data. But before we do that, I want to say that identifying fraud is our chief goal, but we ignore thresholds of materiality. Why? Because a small fraud is often the tip of the iceberg. So that small problem we saw in those single audits were actually representative of what is a 250 million and growing fraud in Minnesota. So when we design data analytics projects, and this is from a practitioner point of view, not from the technologist point of view, we look at what grant program processes are at risk, what fraud schemes are possible, and then, of course, what data is available to speak to those schemes. Bottom line, what do we want to know? Okay, now again, AI, you don't need to know exactly what you want to know. You just are looking for risks. Data analytics, you need to know in advance. So you may want to know, are you seeing indicators of kickbacks? in your grant data? Are grantees billing for ghost payrollers or ghost beneficiaries? Are bills being submitted for time not work? Is there embezzlement going on? Are there fictitious vendors? Is your grantee paying for luxury items for employees' personal use on the organization's P card or credit card? The answer lies in a multidisciplinary approach. So we really are huge believers in the importance of multidisciplinary teams. Someone who has investigative experience and knows fraud schemes. Someone who, like Pete, who has the technology skills to marry huge data sets and pull them together and prepare the data for analysis. Accounting know-how, and of course, program expertise. Because once that data is produced, you need someone who knows the program and fraud schemes to say, oh, look at that. Data analysis will not find the answers, it will frame the questions. You need an investigative team. Now, that could be someone that's inside your shop, it could be your inspector general, or of course, it could be an external consultant like us. So I've been in love with data to detect fraud for a very, very long time. I've been around for a very, very long time. And one of my early projects using data analytics is I was walking through Chicago Public Schools. I was an investigative reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times, and I see this recycling bin with loads and loads of printouts that are like 4 inches thick. So I put them in my little satchel, take them back to the office. I immediately see a cluster. I see a cluster of 5 companies that whose principals were indicted. But every time those 5 appeared, there was a 6th company. And that company was called Arthur Usher and Sons. So, to being the good investigator that I am, I immediately asked for all those billing reports, and then I inputted all that data into Excel. I did it the old way. And I found that they were billing for 10 individuals, sheet metal workers named Usher. Okay. Now, I have come from a big family. There were 36 cousins originally. We have had family reunions for over 50 years, and we have these robust debates, I should say, about politics, and all sorts of other things. And I can't imagine 10 Vanderweel men working in the same company. It just would never work. So end up finding that 5 of these individuals named Usher had never worked for the company, and they were furious that their relative was billing their names. A 6th one was not even in this case, a pipe fitter. My apologies. And so that turned out to be the fall of the House of Usher. So let's look at some grant program specific data analysis. Again, let's take programs for refugees and unaccompanied children. Let's start where Pete left off. Okay, so here's a scheme. And of course, we could have picked from thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of examples, but grantees send children to fraudulent sponsors and human traffickers for bribes. Now, if anybody watched the congressional hearings on this, looked at the Florida presentment, you'll know that this actually happened in a tragic way. In one of our presentations, we talked about nearly $1 billion went to an organization over 5 years that after it was known and complained that they were raping children. This is an American tragedy. But the data, obtain lists of sponsors and children with contact information and dates. Analysis, create pivot tables to identify the children released to the same address or phone number over 12 months. In Florida, 45 children were delivered to one home, according to the presentment. 1 child was delivered to a strip club. Red flags, identify each address that claims to sponsor more than 3 unrelated children at a time. So one of the an additional analysis can be cross-referencing those sponsor addresses against commercial zoning databases or Google Maps API. And that's something that Pete is just amazing at. He can create this whole map like of the United States and put where all the grants are. Well, the same thing here. He can take the map of where the children are being dropped off and look at whether those are residential homes or not. Another scheme, grantees bill for children who have already been released or never arrived. The data from the case management system and daily census logs used for invoicing. The analysis, compare the official release date against the daily census for each child. The red flags, investigate when billing continues days or week after a child has been released. Let's take an example from housing. The scheme, grantees bill or beneficiaries receive payment for housing that doesn't exist. Data, application property addresses, United States Post Office, vacant address data, commercial zoning data, Zillow batch databases. And some of these databases you as representatives of government agencies can get may or may not be publicly available. But overlaying these addresses with these batch databases is a very powerful way to find problems. And then you can look at houses that are supposed to be residential or addresses that are supposed to represent a single family home or a multifamily home, but instead they're on vacant lots or commercial zoning. Once we looked at a group of HUBZone companies, for example, and we found, sure enough, that the address was actually a bridge. And so the red flag would be a primary residence flagged as a commercial warehouse, liquor store, or empty lot. Here's an example from the medical provider fraud. Now, early intervention, as many of you know, is a program that's for children 0 to 3 with developmental delays or disabilities. And so in this case, and unfortunately, all these cases went on and on and on and on before they were discovered, but billing for services not rendered, therapist billing for services that never actually took place, and making between hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. Some therapists claim to have worked every single day for years, including New Year's Eve. Some claims I think if I remember correctly, it was like 11 p.m. on New Year's Eve. And you had one audacious provider who was posting her South American vacation pictures while she was also billing in New York. So this is another case study. We looked at nearly $40 million of P-card expenditures. P-card, of course, are credit cards, but with a higher limit than credit cards. And these are some of the analysis we did, because it wasn't only about fraud, it was just also about unnecessary expenditure. And we came up with 145 employees of interest, and a number of whom ended up getting arrested for theft. We looked for records of keywords associated with luxury items. And here are some of the categories of interest. Okay, now this is an organization that had nothing to do with food, nothing to do with retail, nothing to do with clothing. And employees were spending this money on barber and beauty shops, bicycle shops, boat dealers. They were buying boats. They were paying for marinas, charitable social organizations. They were donating to, a lot of luxury items. They were paying for their dentist bills, their doctor bills, their elementary and secondary school tuition. And the list goes on and on and on. Political donations they were making, religious organizations were getting their money, religious goods were also being purchased, stamp and coins. Again, a company that has nothing to do with these items. Pet stores. Our number one card holder had spent over $1 million, which was interesting. And here's an example of one of those 145 people made 873 transactions, to a lot of questionable places. Now, it doesn't mean the Four Seasons Hotel in London wasn't a legitimate expense this was a Fortune 500 company, but again, it's something just to check into. A lot of retailers, you can see those here. Those are hard to track down because there are legitimate reasons you might want to go to Walmart if you're working in a school, for example. Homeless kids' clothing, for example, is a good, but that's where the investigation comes in. So as the result of this particular program, or our review, I should say, transactions dropped by over 45,000. Credit card expenses dropped by more than 16 million a year. And that, so much of this was they suddenly realized that somebody was looking. Before, nobody was looking. And none of this met the threshold of materiality. And so the auditors had never looked at this before. Now, when we talk about the data analytics process, it's a lot more difficult than the AI process. It starts by, obviously identifying and obtaining the data, and then aggregating the data. And this is, again, one thing that Pete is brilliant at is marrying data from, and large amounts of data from different sources, and then cleaning the data. Okay, cleaning is, another word for that is normalizing the data, removing errors, but also standardizing categories, which we'll talk about in a minute. Analyzing, that's the fun part, right? After all this work, maybe 70–80% of the project is in the first two areas, and then you get to the analysis, and that's when you can have a lot of fun. And then, of course, again, this is something Pete's very good at, is visualizing the data so that the insights are presented clearly. So here's an example of what we mean when we say normalizing data is difficult. So in that credit card project, there were something like, I don't know how many there are, more than, so let's say 10 different categories of meals and food. And so we had to normalize or standardize or clean the data to just get one single category called meals and food, because this wasn't a company that was in the meal or food business. And so we'd like them to know how much they're spending on meals and food. The challenge is that data is not, as I said, consistently categorized. The fields are not consistently labeled, but what I also didn't mention is that categories are not necessarily created to detect fraud or identify significant trends. The people who designed this were not, probably were not, fraud investigators. Again, there's been a lot of progress in that area with banks and such, but we're talking government, and there's much legacy data lying around in government. Here's a fictitious company, but 17 different ways that company could be reflected in, again, legacy data, making it difficult. Now, if any of you remember the old, ACL software, this would pick this up by, you'd look at just TEND, and you didn't have fuzzy logic as an option, now you do. Data error entries are common. We did a project for the Office of Special Trustee of American Industry, and we were looking for thousands of Native Americans going back to 1900 who were owed money by the government for these leases, the gas and such leases. And 2/3 had no Social Security number or date of birth, and we were actually quite successful in finding many of them. But when we looked at the data was just filled with errors. We had Social Security numbers in the date of birth fields and vice versa. So it's not in the legacy data in particular, it's not uncommon to see this. And so preparing or cleansing the data would entail going from the left column to the right column. And for larger data sets that Excel cannot support, coding may be necessary. And I know that Pete uses Python to use some of this. So we're going to talk about one more case study, payroll fraud, and then hopefully you'll have some questions along the way. But we analyzed $7 billion of payroll expenditures. It was a proof of concept project to identify red flags of fraud or irregular patterns. Unfortunately, this was a case, and you all know something about this in government where there was a change of administrations. So on the day we were presenting our proof of concept, hoping, of course, to go into a lot more depth, the new administration was not interested in looking at this. But in that proof of concept project, we found that there were nearly 100 instances in which active government employees were paid more than $10,000 after taxes in a single pay period. And that's, well over $260,000 a year, which is not common in government agencies such as the one we were looking at. There were dozens of instances in which active employees were paid for more than 500 hours. Now, this agency had a residency requirement, but we found hundreds of employees that were associated with addresses that were as far away as hundreds of miles away, right? And so that in itself needed to be looked at. There were many manual and off-cycle checks. Some employees had no taxes withheld. Dozens of active employees were not associated with any address at all, which reminds me of the story where a clerk, it was in a county government, a clerk was responsible for taking people off the payroll who had left the organization. And she did that for 6 employees. They left, but then she put them back on and directed their paychecks into her bank account. Okay, and again, this is something that data analytics is great at catching. We just wish it was used earlier on instead of after the fact. So we are a company, and I just thought I'd just take a moment to talk about the services that we provide. We have something called Agent Tipster, which is really essentially what you saw today. We'll take a large data set. We'll look for items that may suggest fraud, waste, and abuse. We'll use AI and data analytics to look at it. It's conducted in a secure environment and produce actionable reports of risk indicators. We can, we heard the story years ago from, actually it was CDW, and they said our data analytics came in and they gave us a huge file of risk indicators, and our managers didn't know what to do with it. And that's where having a team of investigators and accountants who can follow those risk indicators could be very, very helpful. Of course, if somebody wants to do that themselves, then that's a different matter. But we provide kind of an end-to-end examination of that. We also, now one of the things that Pete's analysis showed, but it was very, very quick, and it's something I want to dig into a lot more, is that in these audit findings, we find that lack of process and procedure is a key reason for these findings. And, we come from government, so we know that when you're in government, you're building the plane as you're flying it, and you're fighting fires every day. Who has time to build correct processes and procedures? And although this isn't a sexy area, an area that makes headlines, it's a very, very important area for grant programs to work well. And again, we talked a lot about that in our last webinar. But what we've done is we've taken over, and I just got the updated number yesterday. We've taken more than 700 grant activities and embedded with them into them compliance requirements, fraud controls, internal controls, outcomes and reporting requirements, et cetera, et cetera. We love to, even though it sounds very boring, love to build policies, procedures, tools, those kinds of things. We also can conduct pre-award on subrecipients. And this Guardrails 360 can also be used for a large grantee that's receiving a grant to determine whether they're ready for a grant, or for subrecipients to know whether your subrecipients are ready for a grant in the compliance area. We also do monitoring, which is our bread and butter. We can do turnkey monitoring reviews, or we can support your team with sampling, analysis, note-taking, and report writing. We can assist, as we have with in New Jersey, we help build their monitoring program that they went and executed. We also provide compliance matrices and monitoring tools based on legal, regulatory program and policy analysis. That in itself can take a lot of time. I'm sure, like many of you, we are really, really focused on what is the standard. And we want to know, what is the standard? What is the citation? What is the evidence to prove that standard was violated or not violated, right? What is the finding? We like to talk about best practices, but we don't want to confuse them. If you're going to say somebody's doing something wrong, it should be based on a standard. And we have entire programs that just do programmatic monitoring. And then we have programs that just do fiscal. And then, of course, we provide technical assistance and training. So I'd like to ask whether anybody has any questions. Jessica, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. So we have one question so far. So y'all don't be shy. Feel free to drop them in the QA section. The first one is, how do you determine which technologies like AI, data analytics, etc., or platforms to use on a project?
Okay, I'm going to turn this over to Pete to answer.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you, Jessica. I'll first say that it's years of experience playing around with different tools, different situations, different requirements, learning what they do, keeping current on what tools are going on. And from there, I take it into a constraint methodology. Who's going to be using it? What's the budget for using it? And what is the size and source of your data? By targeting those areas, if, for example, within technical skills, are the teams coders? Are they non-coders? You're going to make a different change based on that. You might use Python versus an AI tool, and that is a major first constraint. Data constraints. What's the size of the files that you're working with? Are they Excel CSV, less than a gigabyte? A gigabyte might sound like a large file, but within the data world, that's actually fairly small. And so if you can house your data in Excel and CSV files, it makes more tools available. Now, if it's getting larger into 50 CSV files, large data sets, massive data, sensitive data, there might be more specific tools to use that have additional security constraints. And then finally, budget. I know everyone, how much does it cost? There's a lot of open source and free tools. Those are less secure and less tailored to your needs, obviously. But there's also low or enterprise budget tools that can be effective as well. And so I look at it, once I've identified those constraints, what's my speed to actually getting outputs? I don't want a 3-month project. I want a 1-week project. Okay, I might use a different tool here because I don't need to build infrastructure. If this tool works and we want to scale it, other departments want to use it, can I build on top of what I'm doing? Or if it's an Excel and CSV, I probably need to redo the whole thing. And so there's some scalability issues as well. And then finally, the integrations part. There are different tools that can integrate well with different data sources. Some do some better than others. And so taking all those factors into account, you'd be able to find a tool that will be most tailored for you and your needs.
Okay,
well, thank you so much.
I was just going to ask if you have any comments on the presentation, we'd really appreciate it. Any feedback. That feedback helps us to determine what our next webinar is going to be. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Yes, ma'am. We have another question. For roles requiring both automation and human discretion, what strategies can grant teams use to prevent AI tools from generating excessive false positives and overwhelming human reviews?
Okay, well, I think we did talk a little bit about this, and the point is, well, Pete, why don't you take this one?
Sure. So Mary Beth showed that slide earlier showing the data analytics process, and I actually like to use that as part of an AI process too, where I use AI to help me with each piece of that process. And then it comes in the human validation factor. That could be something like sampling data. So a lot of times, if I want to make sure a tool works, I'll have a smaller data set that I know how it should produce an output and test it on something like that. But it's really that human factor, people within the program, people who know what the transactional level data are, to be able to give it a sniff test and then run statistical analysis on that. But that's where the human aspect is very significant in ensuring the outputs are what you're looking for.
Excellent. We also have another question as well. What would be the best approach to learn which of the offered services is the best fit for a particular agency and program type?
I think this question too goes back to the first one. It's a lot of looking to see what's out there. There's each day it seems like nowadays that there's a new tool that's promising something that's revolutionary, and you get in there and okay, it does this thing really well, but that's clearly where they focused. And so getting a little bit of hands-on, finding your data person or working with outsourced teams to determine what the needs are would be your best bet.
Yeah, and I would again add, you start out with what do you want to know?
The goal
Right.
at first, yeah, every single
Your
time.
strategic goals and strategy, building investigative strategy is one of the hardest parts about investigations because, we've seen teams spend $1 million on an investigation, going down many rabbit holes that did not produce anything. And so you have to be laser focused on what you're trying to achieve, and that has to be your guiding star throughout the entire project.
And Mary Beth, actually, I think I misinterpreted the question, so I apologize for that. Which of the offered services from Vanderbilt Group would be the best fit for the agency and program type? And I think, and Mary Beth, so I would turn that over to you.
Right, and it also goes to the stage in the grant program. If you're just starting out a new program or you have considerable concerns about deficiency in your processes and procedures, and you want to make sure that your subrecipients have training and such, well, then you're going to want Guardrails 360 because that will build. Now, if you have some historical data already under your belt, then that's Agent Tipster. Take a look at your risk assessment. On the back end, meaningful monitoring is a great way to meet the federal requirements for monitoring. And of course, your subrecipients are struggling. We have many, many new subrecipients who have never managed grants, and they came in under COVID. And those folks may not only need training in compliance, but also training on management. I mean, we helped in this case, it was a vendor, not a grantee, but she was getting millions of dollars of government contracts, and she did not know how to recruit. She did not know how to find profitability. And we were able, during the monitoring review, go in and show her what is a rolling forecast, for example. So I think that wraps it up.
And finally, I would just say too, if you please reach out to us if those are questions, please email us. We would love to jump on the phone with you and have a meeting to discuss some of the issues and potential strategies to mitigate them.